Chapter 9. Sir Richard. The floor of the tunnel along which Paul Bodkin conducted Blake inclined ever upwards, and again it was broken by flights of steps which carried them always to higher levels. To Blake, the way seemed interminable. Even the haunting mystery of the long tunnel failed to overcome the monotony of its unchanging walls that slipped silently into the torch's dim ken for a brief instant, and as silently back into the Cimmerian oblivion behind to make place for more wall, unvaryingly identical. But, as there ever is to all things, there was an end to the tunnel. Blake first glimpsed it in a little patch of distant daylight ahead, and presently he stepped out into the sunlight and looked out across a wide valley that was tree-dotted and beautiful. He found himself standing upon a wide ledge or shelf some 100 feet above the base of the mountain through which the tunnel had been cut. There was a sheer drop before him, and to his right the ledge terminated abruptly at a distance of 100 feet or less. Then he glanced to the left, and his eyes went wide in astonishment. Across the shelf stood a solid wall of masonry, flanked at either side by great, round towers pierced by long, narrow embrasures. In the center of the wall was a lofty gateway which was closed by a massive and handsomely wrought portcullis, behind which Blake saw two Negroes standing guard. They were clothed precisely as his captors, but held great battle-axes, the butts of which rested upon the ground. "What ho, the gate!" shouted Paul Bodkin. "Open to the outer guard and a prisoner." Slowly the portcullis rose, and Blake and his captor passed beneath. Directly inside the gateway and at the left, built into the hillside, was what was evidently a guardhouse. Before it loitered a score or so of soldiers, uniformed like Paul Bodkin, upon the breast of each the red cross. To a heavy wooden rail, gaily caparisoned horses were tethered, their handsome trappings recalling to Blake's memory paintings he had seen of mounted knights of medieval England. There was so much of unreality in the strangely garbed blacks, the massive barbican that guarded the way, the trappings of the horses, that Blake was no longer capable of surprise when one of the two doors in the guardhouse opened, and there stepped out a handsome young man clad in a hauberk of chain-mail, over which was a light surcoat of rough stuff, dyed purple. Upon the youth's head fitted a leopard-skin bassinet, from the lower edge of which depended a camail or gorget of chain-mail that entirely surrounded and protected his throat and neck. He was armed only with a heavy sword and a dagger, but against the side of the guardhouse, near the doorway, where he paused to look at Blake, leaned a long lance, and near it was a shield with a red cross emblazoned upon its boss. "What zounds!" exclaimed the young man. "What hast thou there, varlet?" "A prisoner, and it pleases thee, noble lord," replied Paul Bodkin deferentially. "Saracen of a surety," stated the young man. "Nay, and I may make so bold, Sir Richard," replied Paul, "but methinks he be no Saracen." "And why?" "With mine own eyes I did see him make the sign before the cross." "Fetch him hither, lout." Bodkin prodded Blake in the rear with his pike, but the American scarce noticed the offense, so occupied was his mind by the light of truth that had so suddenly illuminated it. In the instant he had grasped the solution. He laughed inwardly at himself for his denseness. Now he understood everything, and these fellows thought they could put it over on him, did they? Well, they had come near to doing it all right. He stepped quickly toward the young man and halted, upon his lips a faintly sarcastic smile. The other eyed him with haughty arrogance. "Whence comest thou?" he asked, "and what doest thou in the valley of the sepulchre, varlet?" Blake's smile faded. Too much was too much. "Cut the comedy, young fellow," he drawled in his slow way. "Where's the director? Director, forsooth, I know not what thou meanest. Yes, you don't, snapped Blake with fine sarcasm. But let me tell you right off the bat that no $7.50 a day extra can pull anything like that with me. Odds blood, fellow, I ken not the meaning of all the words, but I mislike thy tone. It savours o'er much of insult to fall sweetly upon the ears of Richard Montmorency. Be yourself, advised Blake. If the director isn't handy, send for the assistant director or the cameraman. Even the continuity writer may have more sense than you seem to have. Be myself? And who thinkest thee I would be other than Richard Montmorency, a noble knight of Nimar? Blake shook his head in despair. Then he turned to the soldiers who were standing about listening to the conversation. He thought some of them would be grinning at the joke that was being played on him, but he saw only solemn, serious faces. "Look here," he said, addressing Paul Bodkin. "Don't any of you know where the director is?" "Director," repeated Bodkin, shaking his head. "There be none in Nimmer thus ye clept, nay, nor in all the valley of the sepulchre that I wot." "I'm sorry," said Blake. "The mistake is mine. But if there is no director, there must be a keeper. May I see him?" "Ah, keeper," cried Bodkin, his face lighting with understanding. "Sir Richard is the keeper." "My God!" exclaimed Blake, turning to the young man. "I beg your pardon. I thought that you were one of the inmates." "Inmates? Indeed, thou speakest a strange tongue, and yet, withal it hath the flavour of England," replied the young man gravely. "But yon varlet be right. I am indeed this day the keeper of the gate." Blake was commencing to doubt his own sanity, or at least his judgment. Neither the young white man nor any of the Negroes had any of the facial characteristics of mad men. He looked up suddenly at the keeper of the gate. "I am sorry," he said, flashing one of the frank smiles that was famous amongst his acquaintances. "I have acted like a boor, but I've been under considerable of a nervous strain for a long time, and on top of that I've been lost in the jungle for days, without proper or sufficient food. Or I thought that you were trying to play some sort of a joke on me, and, well, I wasn't in any mood for jokes when I expected friendship and hospitality instead. Tell me, where am I? What country is this?" "Thou art close upon the city of Nimr," replied the young man. "I suppose this is something of a national holiday or something," suggested Blake. "I do not understand thee," replied the young man. "Why, you're all in a pageant or something, aren't you?" "Odds bodikins, the fellow speaks an outlandish tongue. Pageant? Yes, those costumes. What be amiss with this apparel? True, 'tis not of any wondrous newness, but methinks it be at least more fair than thine. At least it well suffices the daily service of a knight." "You don't mean that you dress like this every day?" demanded Blake. "And why not? But enough of this. I have no wish to further bandy words with thee. Fetch him within, two of thee, and thou, Bodkin, return to the outer guard." The young man turned and re-entered the building, while two of the soldiers seized Blake, none too gently, and hustled him within. He found himself in a high-ceiled room with walls of cut stone and great hand-hewn beams and rafters blackened with age. Upon the stone floor stood a table, behind which, upon a bench, the young man seated himself while Blake was placed facing him with a guard on either hand. "Thy name?" demanded the young man. "Blake." "That be all, just Blake. James Hunter Blake. What title bearest thou in thine own country?" "I have no title." "Ah, thou art not a gentleman, then." "I am called one." "What is thy country?" "America." "America. There is no such country, fellow." "And why not?" "I never heard of it." "What doest thou near the valley of the sepulchre? Didst not know 'tis forbidden?" "I told you I was lost. I didn't know where I was." All I want is to get back to my safari or to the coast. That be impossible. We be surrounded by Saracens. For 735 years we have been invested by their armies. How come you through the enemy's lines? How passed you through his vast army? There isn't any army. Givest thou the lie to Richard Montmorency, varlet, and thou wert of gentle blood, thou shouldst account to me that insult upon the field of honor. Methinks thou beest some low-born spy sent hither by the Saracen Sultan. 'Twould be well an thou confessed all to me, for if I take thee before the prince, he will wrest the truth from thee in ways that are far from pleasant. What say? I have nothing to confess. Take me before the prince or whoever your boss is. Perhaps he will at least give me food. Thou shalt have food here. Never shall it be said that Richard Montmorency turned a hungry man from his doorway. Hey, Michel. Michel, where is the lazy brat? Michel. A door opened from an inner apartment to admit a boy, sleepy-eyed, digging a grimy fist into one eye. He was clothed in a short tunic, his legs encased in green tights. In his cap was a feather. "Sleeping again, eh?" demanded Sir Richard. "Thou lazy knave, fetch bread and meat for this poor wayfarer, and be not until the morrow at it." Wide-eyed and rather stupidly, the boy stared at Blake. "Saracen, master?" he asked. "What boots it?" snapped Sir Richard. "Did not our Lord Jesus feed the multitude, nor ask if there were unbelievers among them? Haste, churl. The stranger be of great hunger." The youth turned and shuffled from the room, wiping his nose upon his sleeve, and Sir Richard's attention came back to Blake. "Thou art not ill-favoured, fellow," he said. "'Tis a pity that thou beest not of noble blood, for thy mien appeareth not like that of one low-born." "I never considered myself low-born," said Blake with a grin. "Thy father, now, was he not at least a Sir Knight?" Blake was thinking quickly now. He was far from being able as yet to so much as hazard a guess that might explain his host's archaic costume and language, but he was sure that the man was in earnest, whether sane or not. And were he not sane, it seemed doubly wise to humor him. "Yes, indeed," he replied. "My father is a 32nd degree Mason and a Knight Templar." "'Sblood, I knew it," cried Sir Richard. "And so am I," added Blake, when he realized the happy effect his statement had produced. "Ah, I knew it. I knew it," cried Sir Richard. "Thy bearing proclaimed thy noble blood, but why didst thou seek to deceive me? And so thou art one of the poor knights of Christ, and of the Temple of Solomon, who guard the ways of the pilgrims to the Holy Land. This explaineth thy poor raiment, and glorifies it." Blake was mystified by the allusion, as the picture always suggested by a reference to Knights Templar was of waving white plumes, gorgeous aprons, and glittering swords. He did not know that, in the days of their origin, they were clothed in any old garments that the charity of others might bequeath them. At this moment Michel returned, bearing a wooden trencher containing cold mutton and several pieces of simnel bread, and carrying in one hand a flagon of wine. These he set upon the table before Blake, and going to a cupboard, fetched 2 metal goblets, into which he decanted a portion of the contents of the flagon. Sir Richard arose, and taking one of the goblets, raised it before him, on a level with his head. "Hal, Sir James," he cried, "and welcome to Nimor and the Valley of the Sepulchre." "Here's looking at you," replied Blake. "A quaint saying," remarked Sir Richard. "Methinks the ways of England must be changed since the days of Richard the Lion-Hearted, when my noble ancestor set forth upon the great crusade in the company of his king. Here's looking at you, odds bodikins, I must not let that from my memory. Here's looking at you. Just wait thou, till some fair knight doth drink my health, I shall lay him flat with that. But stay, Here, Michel, fetch yon stool for Sir James, and eat, Sir Knight. Thou must be passing hungry. I'll tell the world I am, replied Blake feelingly, as he sat down on the stool that Michel brought. There were no knives or forks, but there were fingers, and these Blake used to advantage, while his host sat smiling happily at him from across the rude table. "Thou art better than a minstrel for pleasure," cried Sir Richard. "I'll tell the world I am. Ho, ho, thou wilt be a gift from heaven in the castle of the prince. I'll tell the world I am." When Blake had satisfied his hunger, Sir Richard ordered Michiel to prepare horses. "We ride down to the castle, Sir James," he explained. "No longer art thou my prisoner, but my friend and guest. That I should have received thee so scurvily shalt ever be to my discredit." Mounted upon prancing chargers and followed at a respectful distance by Michiel, the two rode down the winding mountain road. Sir Richard now carried his shield and lance, a pennon fluttering bravely in the wind from just below the tip of the latter, the sun glancing from the metal of his hauberk, a smile upon his brave face as he chatted with his erstwhile prisoner. To Blake he seemed a gorgeous picture ridden from out the pages of a storybook. Yet, belying his martial appearance, there was a childlike simplicity about the man that won Blake's liking from the first, for there was that about him that made it impossible for one to conceive him as the perpetrator of a dishonorable act. His ready acceptance of Blake's statements about himself bespoke a credulity that seemed incompatible with the high intelligence reflected by his noble countenance, and the American preferred to attribute it to a combination of unsophistication and an innate integrity which could not conceive of perfidy in others. As the road rounded the shoulder of a hill, Blake saw another barbican barring the way, and beyond, the towers and battlements of an ancient castle. At a command from Sir Richard, the warders of the gate opened to them, and the three rode through into the ballium. This space between the outer and inner walls appeared unkept and neglected. Several old trees flourished within it, and beneath the shade of one of these, close to the outer gateway, lolled several men-at-arms, two of whom were engaged in a game that resembled draughts. At the foot of the inner wall was a wide moat, the waters of which reflected the grey stones of the wall, and the ancient vines that, growing upon its inner side, topped it to form a leafy coping that occasionally hung low upon the outer side. Directly opposite the barbican was the great gateway in the inner wall, and here a drawbridge spanned the moat, and a heavy portcullis barred the way into the great court of the castle. But at a word from Sir Richard, the gate lifted, and, clattering across the drawbridge, they rode within. Before Blake's astonished eyes loomed a mighty castle of rough-hewn stone, while to the right and left, within the great court, spread broad gardens not illy kept, in which were gathered a company of men and women who might have just stepped from Arthur's court. At sight of Sir Richard and his companion, the nearer members of the company regarded Blake with interest and evident surprise. Several called greetings and questions to Sir Richard as the two men dismounted and turned their horses over to Michiel. "Ho, Richard," cried one, "what bringest thou, a Saracen?" "Nay," replied Richard, "a fair Sir Knight who would do his devoir to the prince." "Where be he?" "Yonder," and they pointed toward the far end of the court, where a large company was assembled. "Come, Sir James," directed Richard, and led him down the courtyard, the knights and ladies following closely, asking questions, commenting with a frankness that brought a flush to Blake's face. The women openly praised his features and his carriage, while the men, perhaps prompted by jealousy, made unflattering remarks about his soiled and torn apparel and its, to them, ridiculous cut. And indeed the contrast was great between their gorgeous dalmaticas of Villosa or Ciclas, their close-fitting tights, their colored caps and Blake's drab shirt, whipcord breeches and cordovan boots, now soiled, torn and scratched. The women were quite as richly dressed as the men, wearing clinging mantles of rich stuff, their hair and shoulders covered with dainty wimples of various colors, and often elaborately embroidered. None of these men, nor any of those in the assemblage they were approaching, wore armor. But Blake had seen an armored knight at the outer gateway, and another at the inner, and he judged that only when engaged in military duties did they wear this heavy and uncomfortable dress. When they reached the party at the end of the court, Sir Richard elbowed his way among them to the center of the group, where stood a tall man of imposing appearance, chatting with those about him. As Sir Richard and Blake halted before him, the company fell silent. "My lord Prince," said Richard, bowing, "I bring thee Sir James, a worthy knight Templar who hath come under the protection of God through the lines of the enemy to the gates of Nimir." The tall man eyed Blake searchingly, and he had not the appearance of great credulity. "Thou sayest that thou comest from the Temple of Solomon in the kingdom of Jerusalem?" he demanded. "Sir Richard must have misunderstood me," replied Blake. "Then thou art no Knight Templar." "Yes, but I am not from Jerusalem." "Perchance he is one of those doughty Sir Knights that guard the pilgrim's way to the Holy Land," suggested a young woman standing near the prince. Blake glanced quickly at the speaker, and as their eyes met, hers fell, but not before he had seen that they were very beautiful eyes, set in an equally beautiful oval face. "More like it haps he be a Saracen spy sent among us by the Sultan," snapped a dark man who stood beside the girl. The latter raised her eyes to the prince. "He looketh not like a Saracen, my father," she said. "What knowest thou of the appearance of a Saracen, child?" demanded the prince. "Hast seen so many?" The party laughed, and the girl pouted. "Verily, and I hast seen full as many a Saracen as has Sir Malud or thyself, my lord prince," she snapped haughtily. "Let Sir Malud describe a Saracen." The dark young man flushed angrily. "At least," he said, "my lord prince, I knowest an English knight when I seest one, and if here be an English knight, then Sir Malud be a Saracen." "Enough," said the prince, and then, turning to Blake, "If thou art not from Jerusalem, where art thou from?" "New York," replied the American. "Ha!" whispered Sir Malud to the girl. "Didst I not tell you?" "Tell me what?" "That he is from New York. Where is that?" she demanded. "Some stronghold of the infidel," asserted Malud. "New York," repeated the prince. "Be that in the Holy Land. It is sometimes called New Jerusalem," explained Blake. "And thou comest to Nimr through the lines of the enemy. Tell me, Sir Knight, had they many men at arms, and how were their forces disposed? Be they close upon the valley of the sepulchre? Thinkest thou they plan an early attack? Come, tell me all. Thou canst be of great service." "I have come for days through the forest and seen no living man," said Blake. "No enemy surrounds you." "What?" cried the prince. "Didst I not tell thee?" demanded Malud. "He is an enemy spy. He would lead us into the belief that we are safe, that the forces of the Sultan may find us off our guard, and take Nimr and the valley." "Odds blood, methinks thou beest right, Sir Malud," cried the prince. "No enemy indeed. Why else then hast the knights of Nimr lain here 7.5 centuries, if there be no horde of infidels surrounding our stronghold?" "Search me," said Blake. "Eh, what?" demanded the prince. "He hath a quaint manner of speech, my lord prince," explained Richard. "But I do not think him an enemy of England. Myself will vouch for him, and you will take him into your service, my lord prince." "Wouldst enter my service, sir?" demanded the prince. Blake glanced at Sir Malud and looked dubious. Then his eyes wandered to those of the girl. "I'll tell the world I would," he said. Chapter 10. The Return of Ulala. Numa was hungry. For 3 days and 3 nights he had hunted, but always the prey had eluded him. Perhaps Numa was growing old. Not so keen were his scent and his vision, not so swift his charges, nor well-timed the spring that heretofore had brought down the quarry. So quick the food of Numa that a fraction of a second, a hair's breadth, might mark the difference between a full belly and starvation. Perhaps Numa was growing old, yet he still was a mighty engine of destruction, and now the pangs of hunger had increased his ferocity. Manyfold stimulated his cunning, emboldened him to take great risks that his belly might be filled. It was a nervous, irascible, ferocious Numa that crouched beside the trail. His up-pricked ears, his intent and blazing eyes, his quivering nostrils, the gently moving tail tip evidenced his awareness of another presence. Down the wind to the nostrils of Numa the lion came the man scent. 4 days ago, his belly full, Numa had doubtless slunk away at the first indication of the presence of man, but today is another day and another Numa. Zaid, 3 days upon the back track from the menzil of the Sheikh Ibn Yad, thought of Ataya, of far Guad, congratulated himself upon the good fortune that had thus far smiled upon his escape and flight. His mare moved slowly along the jungle trail, unurged, for the way was long, and just ahead a beast of prey waited in ambush. But Numa's were not the only ears to hear, nor his nostrils the only nostrils to scent the coming of the man-thing. Another beast crouched near, unknown to Numa. Over-anxious, fearful of being cheated of his meat, Numa made a false move. Down the trail came the mare. She must pass within a yard of Numa, but Numa could not wait. Before she was within the radius of his spring, he charged, voicing a horrid roar. Terrified, the mare reared and, rearing, tried to turn and bolt. Overbalanced, she toppled backward and fell, and in falling unhorsed Zaid. But in the instant she was up and flying back along the trail, leaving her master in the path of the charging lion. Horrified, the man saw the snarling face, the bared fangs almost upon him. Then he saw something else, something equally awe-inspiring. A naked giant who leaped from a swaying branch full upon the back of the great cat. He saw a bronzed arm encircle the neck of the beast of prey as the lion was borne to earth by the weight and impact of the man's body. He saw a heavy knife flashing in the air, striking home again and again as the frenzied lion threw itself about in futile effort to dislodge the thing upon its back. He heard the roars and the growls of El Adria, and mingled with them were growls and snarls that turned his blood cold, for he saw that they came from the lips of the man-beast. Then Numa went limp, and the giant arose and stood above the carcass. He placed one foot upon it, and, raising his face toward the heavens, voiced a hideous scream that froze the marrow in the bones of the Bedouin, a scream that few men have heard, the victory cry of the bull-ape. It was then that Zaid recognized his savior and shuddered again, as he saw that it was Tarzan of the apes. The ape-man looked down at him. "Thou art from the menzil of Ibn Yad," he said. "I am but a poor man," replied Zaid. "I but followed where my sheikh led. Hold it not against Zaid Sheikh of the jungle, that he be in thy ballad. Spare my poor life, I pray thee, and may Allah bless thee." "I have no wish to harm thee, Bedoui," replied Tarzan. "What wrong hath been done in my country is the fault of Ibn Yad alone. Is he close by?" "Well, nay, he be many marches from here." "Where art thy companions?" demanded the ape-man. "I have none." "Thou art alone." "Billah, yes." Tarzan frowned. "Think well, Bedoui, before lying to Tarzan," he snapped. "By Ullah, I speak the truth. I am alone." "And why?" "Thought did plot against me to make it appear that I had tried to take the life of Ibn Yad, which, before Allah, is a lie that stinketh to heaven, and I was to be shot. But Ateja, the daughter of the sheikh, cut my bonds in the night, and I escaped. What is thy name? Zaid. Whither goest thou to thine own country? Yes, to Beled el Guad, a Beni Salem Fendi of El Harb. Thou canst not alone survive the perils of the way, Tarzan warned him. Of that I be fearful, but death were certain had I not escaped the wrath of Ibn Jad. For a moment Tarzan was silent in thought. Great must be the love of Ateja, the daughter of the sheikh, and great her belief in you, he said. Well, yes, great is our love, and, too, she knew that I would not slay her father, whom she loves. Tarzan nodded. I believe thee and shall help thee. Thou canst not go on alone. I shall take thee to the nearest village, and there the chief will furnish you with warriors, who will take you to the next village, and thus from village to village you will be escorted to the Sudan. May Ulala ever watch over and guard thee, exclaimed Zaid. Tell me, said Tarzan, as the two moved along the jungle trail in the direction of the nearest village, which lay 2 marches to the south of them. Tell me what Ibn Jad doth in this country. It is not true that he came for ivory alone. Am I not right? Well, yes, Sheikh Tarzan, admitted Zaid. Ibn Jad came for treasure, but not for ivory. What, then? In El Habash lies the treasure city of Nimr, explained Zaid. This Ibn Jad was told by a learned Sahar. So great is the wealth of Nimr that 1,000 camels could carry away not a 10th part of it. It consists of gold and jewels and a woman. A woman? Yes, a woman of such wondrous beauty that in the north she alone would bring a price that would make Ibn Jad rich beyond dreams. Surely thou must have heard of Nimr. Sometimes the Gallas speak of it, said Tarzan, but always I thought it of no more reality than the other places of their legends. And Ibn Jad undertook this long and dangerous journey on no more than the word of a magician. What could be better than the word of a learned Sahar? Demanded Zaid. Tarzan of the Apes shrugged. During the 2 days that it took them to reach the village, Tarzan learned of the white man who had come to the camp of Ibn Jad, but from Zaid's description of him he was not positive whether it was Blake or Stimble. As Tarzan traveled south with Zaid, Ibn Jad trekked northward into El Habash, and Fard plotted with Tolog, and Stimble plotted with Fard, while Fejwan, the galley slave, waited patiently for the moment of his delivery from bondage, and Ateya mourned for Zaid. As a boy thou wert raised in this country, Fejwan, she said one day to the galley slave. Tell me, dost thou think Zaid could make his way alone to El Guad? Billah, nay, replied the black. Doubtless he be dead by now. The girl stifled a sob. Fejwan mourns with thee, Ateja, said the black, for Zaid was a kindly man. Would that Allah had spared your lover and taken him who was guilty. What do you mean? Asked Ateja. Knowest thou, Fejwan, who fired the shot at Ibn Jad, my father? It was not Zaid. Tell me it was not Zaid. But thy words tell me that which I well knew before. Zaid could not have sought the life of my father. Nor did he, replied Fejwan. Tell me what you know of this thing. And you will not tell another who told you? He asked. It would go hard with me if one I am thinking of knew that I had seen what I did see. I swear by Allah that I wilt not betray you, Fejwan, cried the girl. Tell me, what didst thou see? I did not see who fired the shot at thy father, Ateja, replied the black. But something else I saw before the shot was fired. Yes, what was it? I saw Fard creep into the bite of Zaid and come out again, bearing Zaid's matchlock. That I saw. I knew it, cried the girl. But Ibn Jad will not believe if you tell him. I know, But now that I am convinced, perhaps I shall find a way to have Fard's blood for the blood of Zayd, cried the girl bitterly. For days Ibn Jad skirted the mountains behind which he thought lay the fabled city of Nimr, as he searched for an entrance which he hoped to find without having recourse to the natives, whose haunts he had sedulously avoided, lest through them opposition to his venture might develop. The country was sparsely settled, which rendered it easy for the Arab to avoid coming into close contact with the natives, though it was impossible that the Gallas were ignorant of their presence. If, however, the blacks were willing to leave them alone, Ibn Jad had no intention of molesting them unless he found that it would be impossible to carry his project to a successful issue without their assistance, in which event he was equally ready to approach them with false promises or ruthless cruelty, whichever seemed the more likely to better serve his purpose. As the days passed, Ibn Jad waxed increasingly impatient, for, search as he would, he could locate no pass across the mountains, nor any entrance to the fabled valley wherein lay the treasure city of Nimr. "Billah," he exclaimed one day, "there be a city of Nimr, and there be an entrance to it, and by Allah, I will find it. Summon the Habash, Tolog. From them or through them, we shall have a clue in one way or another." When Tolog had fetched the gala slaves to the bait of Ibn Jad, the old sheikh questioned them, but there was none who had definite knowledge of the trail leading to Nimr. "Then, by Allah," exclaimed Ibn Jad, "we shall have it from the native Habash." "They be mighty warriors, O brother," cried Tolog, "and we be far within their country. Should we anger them, and they set upon us, it might fare ill with us." "We be Bedawi," said Ibn Jad proudly, "and we be armed with muskets. What could their simple spears and arrows avail against us? But they be many, and we be few," insisted Tolog. "We shall not fight unless we be driven to it," said Ibn Jad. "First we shall seek by friendly overtures to win their confidence and cajole the secret from them. Bejuan," he exclaimed, turning to the great Blake, "thou art a Habashi. I have heard thee say that thou well rememberest the days of thy childhood in the hut of thy father, and the story of Nimr was no new story to you. Go then, and seek out thy people, make friends with them. Tell them that the great Sheikh Ibn Jad comes among them in friendliness, and that he hath gifts for their chiefs. Tell them also that he would visit the city of Nimr, and if they will lead him there, he will reward them well." "I but await thy commands," said Fejwan, elated at this opportunity to do what he had long dreamed of doing. "When shall I set forth?" "Prepare thyself tonight, and when dawn comes depart," replied the sheikh. And so it was that Fejwan, the gala slave, set forth early the following morning from the menzil of Ibn Jad, sheikh of the Fendi El Guad, to search for a village of his own people. By noon he had come upon a well-worn trail leading toward the west, and this he followed boldly, guessing that he would best disarm suspicion thus than by attempting to approach a gala village by stealth. Also, he well knew that there was little likelihood that he could accomplish the latter in any event. Fejwan was no fool. He knew that it might be difficult to convince the Gallas that he was of their blood, for there was against him not alone his Arab garments and weapons, but the fact that he would be able to speak the Gala tongue but lamely after all these years. That he was a brave man was evidenced by the fact that he well knew the suspicious and warlike qualities of his people and their inborn hatred of the Arab, and yet gladly embraced this opportunity to go amongst them. How close he had approached a village Fejwan did not know. There were neither sounds nor odors to enlighten him, when there suddenly appeared in the trail ahead of him 3 husky Gala warriors, and behind him he heard others, though he did not turn. Instantly, Fejwan raised his hands in sign of peace, and at the same time he smiled. "What are you doing in the Gala country?" demanded one of the warriors. I am seeking the house of my father, replied Feijuan. The house of your father is not in the country of the Gallas, growled the warrior. You are one of these who come to rob us of our sons and daughters. No, replied Feijuan. I am a Gala. If you were a Gala, you would speak the language of the Gallas better. We understand you, but you do not speak as a Gala speaks. That is because I was stolen away when I was a child and have lived among the Bedawi since, speaking only their tongue. What is your name? The Bedawi call me Feijuan, but my Gala name was Ulala. Do you think he speaks the truth? Demanded one of the blacks of a companion. When I was a child, I had a brother whose name was Ulala. Where is he? Asked the other warrior. We do not know. Perhaps Simba the lion devoured him. Perhaps the desert people took him. Who knows? Perhaps he speaks the truth, said the second warrior. Perhaps he is your brother. Ask him his father's name. What was your father's name? Demanded the first warrior. Nalini, replied Feijuan. At this reply, the Gala warriors became excited and whispered among themselves for several seconds. Then the first warrior turned again to Feijuan. Did you have a brother? He demanded. Yes, replied Feijuan. What was his name? Tabo, answered Feijuan without hesitation. The warrior who had questioned him leaped into the air with a wild shout. It is Ulala, he cried. It is my brother. I am Tabo. Ulala. Do you not remember me? Tabo, cried Feijuan. No, I would not know you, for you were a little boy when I was stolen away, and now you are a great warrior. Where are our father and mother? Are they alive? Are they well? They are alive and well, Ulala, replied Tabo. Today they are in the village of the chief, for there is a great council because of the presence of some desert people in our country. Came you with them? Yes, I am a slave to the desert people, replied Feijuan. Is it far to the village of the chief? I would see my mother and my father, and, too, I would talk with the chief about the desert people who have come to the country of the Gallas. Come, brother, cried Tabo. We are not far from the village of the chief. Ah, my brother, that I should see you again whom we thought to be dead all these years. Great will be the joy of our father and mother. But tell me, have the desert people turned you against your own people? You have lived with them many years. Perhaps you have taken a wife among them. Are you sure that you do not love them better than you love those whom you have not seen for many years? I do not love the Bedawi, replied Feijuan, nor have I taken a wife among them. Always in my heart has been the hope of returning to the mountains of my own country, to the house of my father. I love my own people, Tabo. Never again shall I leave them. The desert people have been unkind to you. They have treated you with cruelty, demanded Tabo. Nay, on the contrary, they have treated me well, replied Feijuan. I do not hate them, but neither do I love them. They are not of my own blood. I am a slave among them. As they talked, the party moved along the trail towards the village, while two of the warriors ran ahead to carry the glad tidings to the father and mother of the long-missing Ulala. And so it was that when they came within sight of the village, they were met by a great crowd of laughing, shouting Gallias, and in the fore-rank were the father and mother of Feijuan, their eyes blinded by the tears of love and joy that welled at sight of this long-gone child. After the greetings were over, and every man, woman, and child in the company must crowd close and touch the returned wanderer, Tabo conducted Feijuan into the village and the presence of the chief. Apatando was an old man. He had been chief when Ulala was stolen away. He was inclined to be skeptical, fearing a ruse of the desert people, and he asked many questions of Feijuan concerning matters that he might hold in his memory from the days of his childhood. He asked him about the house of his father, and the names of his playmates and other intimate things that an impostor might not know. And when he had done, he arose and took Feijuan in his arms and rubbed his cheek against the cheek of the prodigal. "You are indeed Ulala," he cried. "Welcome back to the land of your people. Tell me now what the desert people do here. Have they come for slaves?" "The desert people will always take slaves when they can get them, but Ibn Jad has not come first for slaves, but for treasure." "Aye, what treasure?" demanded Batando. "He has heard of the treasure city of Nimr," replied Feijuan. "It is a way into the valley where lies Nimr that he seeks. For this he sent me to find Gallus, who would lead him to Nimr. He will make gifts, and he promises rich rewards when he shall have wrested the treasure from Nimr." "Are these true words?" asked Batando. "There is no truth in the beards of the desert dwellers," replied Feijuan. "And if he does not find the treasure of Nimr, perhaps he will try to find treasure and slaves in the Gala country to repay the expense of the long journey he has undertaken from the desert country," asked Batando. "Batando speaks out of the great wisdom of many years," replied Feijuan. "What does he know of Nimr?" asked the old chief. "Naught other than what an old medicine man of the Arab told him," replied Feijuan. "He said to Ibn Jad that great treasure lay hoarded in the city of Nimr, and that there was a beautiful woman who would bring a great price in the far north." "Nothing more he told him?" demanded Batando. "Did he not tell him of the difficulties of entering the Forbidden Valley?" "Nay." "Then we can guide him to the entrance to the valley," said Batando, smiling slyly. Chapter 11. Sir James, as Tarzan and Zaid journeyed toward the village in which the ape-man purposed to enlist an escort for the Arab upon the first stage of his return journey toward his desert home, the Bedouin had time to meditate much upon many matters, and having come to trust and respect his savage guide, he at last unbosomed himself to Tarzan. "Great Sheikh of the jungle," he said one day, "by thy kindness thou hast won the undying loyalty of Zaid, who begs that thou wilt grant him one more favor." "And what is that?" asked the ape-man. "Ataja, whom I love, remains here in the savage country in constant danger so long as Fard be near her. I dare not now return to the menzil of Ibn Jad, even could I find it. But later, when the heat of Ibn Jad's anger will have had time to cool, then I might come again among them and convince him of my innocence, and be near Ataja and protect her from Fard." "What, then, would you do?" demanded Tarzan. "I would remain in the village to which you are taking me until Ibn Jad returns this way toward El Guad. It is the only chance that I have to see Ataja again in this life, as I could not cross the Sudan alone and on foot, should you compel me to leave your country now." "You are right," replied the ape-man. "You shall remain here 6 months. If Ibn Jad has not returned in that time, I shall leave word that you be sent to my home. From there I can find a way to return you in safety to your own country." "May the blessings of Allah be upon thee," cried Zaid. And when they came at last to the village, Tarzan received the promise of the chief to keep Zaid until Ibn Jad returned. After he had left the village again, the ape-man headed north, for he was concerned over the report that Zaid had given him of the presence of a European prisoner among the Ayarab. That Stimbul, whom he had sent eastward toward the coast, should be so far north and west as Zaid had reported, appeared inconceivable. And so it seemed more probable that the prisoner was young Blake, for whom Tarzan had conceived a liking. Of course, the prisoner might not be either Stimbul or Blake, but whoever he was, Tarzan could not readily brook the idea of a white man being permitted to remain a prisoner of the Bedouins. But Tarzan was in no hurry, for Zaid had told him that the prisoner was to be held for ransom. He would have a look about for Blake's camp first, and then follow up the spoor of the Arabs. His progress, therefore, was leisurely. On the second day he met the apes of Toyat, and for 2 days he hunted with them, renewing his acquaintance with Gayat and Zuto, listening to the gossip of the tribe, often playing with the Balus. Leaving them, he loafed on through the jungle, stopping once for half a day to bait Numa where he lay upon a fresh kill, until the earth trembled to the thunderous roars of the maddened king of beasts as the ape-man taunted and annoyed him. Sloughed was the thin veneer of civilization that was Lord Greystoke. Back to the primitive, back to the savage beast, the ape-man reverted as naturally, as simply, as once changes from one suit to another. It was only in his beloved jungle, surrounded by its savage denizens, that Tarzan of the apes was truly Tarzan, for always in the presence of civilized men, there was a certain restraint that was the outcome of that inherent suspicion that creatures of the wild ever feel for man. Tired of throwing ripe fruit at Numa, Tarzan swung away through the middle terraces of the forest, lay up for the night far away, and in the morning, scenting Bara the deer, made a kill and fed. Lazy, he slept again, until the breaking of twigs and the rustle of down-tramped grasses awoke him. He sniffed the air with sensitive nostrils and listened with ears that could hear an ant walk, and then he smiled. Tantor was coming. For half a day he lolled on the huge back, listening to Manu the monkey chattering and scolding among the trees. Then he moved on again. A day or two later he came upon a large band of monkeys. They seemed much excited, and at sight of him they all commenced to jabber and chatter. "Greetings, Manu," cried the ape-man. "I am Tarzan, Tarzan of the apes. What happens in the jungle?" "Gomangani, Gomangani," cried one. "Strange Gomangani," cried another. "Gomangani with thunder sticks," chattered a third. "Where?" asked the ape-man. "There, there," they shouted in chorus, pointing toward the northeast. "Many sleeps away?" asked Tarzan. "Close, close," the monkeys answered. "There is one Tarmangani with them?" "No, only Gomangani. With their thunder sticks they kill little Manu and eat him." "Bad Gomangani. Tarzan will talk with them," said the ape-man. "They will kill Tarzan with their thunder sticks and eat him," prophesied a graybeard. The ape-man laughed and swung off through the trees in the direction Manu had indicated. He had not gone far when the scent spoor of blacks came faintly to his nostrils, and this spoor he followed until presently he could hear their voices in the distance. Silently, warily, Tarzan came through the trees, noiseless as the shadows that kept him company, until he stood upon a swaying limb directly above a camp of Negroes. Instantly, Tarzan recognized the safari of the young American, Blake, and a second later he dropped to the ground before the astonished eyes of the blacks. Some of them would have run, but others recognized him. "It is Big Bwana," they cried. "It is Tarzan of the apes." "Where is your head man?" demanded Tarzan. A stalwart Negro approached him. "I am head man," he said. "Where is your master?" "He is gone many days," replied the black. "Where?" "We do not know. He hunted with a single askar. There was a great storm. Neither of them ever returned. We searched the jungle for them, but could not find them. We waited in camp where they were to have joined us. They did not come. We did not know what to do. We would not desert the young Bwana who was kind to us, but we feared that he was dead. We have not provisions to last more than another moon. We decided to return home and tell our story to the friends of the young Bwana." "You have done well," said Tarzan. "Have you seen a company of the desert people in the jungle?" "We have not seen them," replied the head man. "But while we were searching for the young Bwana, we saw where desert people had camped. It was a fresh camp." "Where?" The black pointed. "It was on the trail to the North Gala country in Abyssinia, and when they broke camp, they went north." "You may return to your village," said Tarzan, But first take those things which are the young Bwanas to his friends to keep for him, and send a runner to the home of Tarzan, with this message. Send 100 Waziri to Tarzan in the North Gala country. From the waterhole of the smooth, round rocks, follow the trail of the desert people. Yes, Big Bwana, it will be done, said the headman. Repeat my message. The black boy did as he was bidden. Good, said Diao Tarzan. I go. Kill not Manu the monkey if you can find other food, for Manu is the cousin of Tarzan and of you. We understand, Big Bwana. In the castle of Prince Gobred, in the city of Nimr James, Hunter Blake was being schooled in the duties of a knight of Nimr. Sir Richard had taken him under his protection and made himself responsible for his training and his conduct. Prince Gobred, quick to realize Blake's utter ignorance of even the simplest observances of knighthood, was frankly skeptical, and Sir Malut was almost openly antagonistic. But the loyal Sir Richard was a well-beloved knight, and so he had his way. Perhaps, too, the influence of the Princess Guinalda was not without its effect upon her sire, for first among the treasures of the Prince of Nimr ranked his daughter Guinalda, and Guinalda's curiosity and interest had been excited by the romance of the coming of this fair stranger knight to the buried and forgotten city of Nimr. Sir Richard had clothed Blake from his own wardrobe until a weaver, a cutter of cloth, a seamstress, and an armorer could fashion one for him. Nor did it take long. A week found Sir James clothed, armored, and horsed as befitted a knight of Nimr, and when he spoke to Sir Richard of payment for all this, he found that money was almost unknown among them. There were, Sir Richard told him, a few pieces of coin that their ancestors had brought here 735 years before, but payment was made by service. The knights served the prince, and he kept them. They protected the laborers and the artisans, and in return received what they required from them. The slaves received their food and clothing from the prince or from whichever knight they served. Jewels and precious metals often changed hands in return for goods or service, but each transaction was a matter of barter, as there were no standards of value. They cared little for wealth. The knights valued most highly their honor and their courage, upon which there could be no price. The artisan found his reward in the high perfection of his handicraft, and in the honors that it brought him. The valley provided food in plenty for all. The slaves tilled the ground. The freedmen were the artisans, the men-at-arms, the herders of cattle. The knights defended Nimr against its enemies, competed in tourneys, and hunted wild game in the valley and its surrounding mountains. As the days passed, Blake found himself rapidly acquiring a certain proficiency in knightly arts under the wise tutorage of Sir Richard. The use of sword and buckler he found most difficult, notwithstanding the fact that he had been proficient with the foils in his college days. For the knights of Nimr knew naught of the defensive use of their two-edged weapons and seldom used the point for other purpose than the coup de grace. For them the sword was almost wholly a cutting weapon, the buckler their sole defense. But as Blake practiced with this weapon, it dawned upon him that his knowledge of fencing might be put to advantage should the necessity arise, to the end that his awkwardness with the buckler should be outweighed by his nicer defensive handling of his sword, and his offensive improved by the judicious use of the point, against which they had developed little or no defense. The lance he found less difficult, its value being so largely dependent upon the horsemanship of him who wielded it, and that Blake was a splendid horseman was evidenced by his polo rating as an 8-goal man. The ballium, or outer court, which lay between the inner and outer walls of the castle and entirely surrounded it, was, upon the north or valley side, given over entirely to knightly practice and training. Here the ballium was very wide, and against the inner wall was built a wooden grand stand that could be quickly removed in the event of an attack upon the castle. Justs and tilts were held here weekly, while the great tourneys that occurred less often were given upon a field outside the castle wall, upon the floor of the valley. Daily, many knights and ladies came to watch the practice and training that filled the ballium with life and action and color during the morning hours. Good-natured banter flew back and forth, wagers were laid, and woe betide the contender who was unhorsed during these practice bouts, for the thing that a knight dreaded, even more than he dreaded death, was ridicule. In the formal jousts that were held weekly, greater decorum was observed by the audience, but during the daily practice their raillery verged upon brutality. It was before such an audience as this that Blake received his training, and because he was a novelty, the audiences were larger than usual, and because the friends of Sir Mallard and the friends of Sir Richard had tacitly acknowledged him as an issue, both the applause and the ridicule were loud and boisterous. Even the prince came often, and Guinalda always was there. It was soon apparent that Prince Gobred leaned slightly to the side of Sir Mallard, with the natural result that Mallard's party immediately acquired numerous recruits. The training of the lads who were squires to the knights and who would one day be admitted to the charmed circle of knighthood occupied the earlier hours of the morning. This was followed by practice tilts between knights, during which Sir Richard or one of his friends undertook the training of Blake at the far side of the ballium, and it was during this practice that the American's outstanding horsemanship became apparent, even Gobred being led to applause. "Odds bodikins," he exclaimed, "the man be a part of his charger." "'Twas but chance that saved him from a fall," said Mallard. "Mayhap," agreed Gobred, "but at that me likes the looks of him within a saddle." "He doeth not too ill with his lance," admitted Mallard, "but odds blood, didst ever see a more awkward lout with a buckler? Methinks he hath had more use for a trencher." This sally elicited roars of laughter, in which the Princess Guinalda did not join, a fact which Mallard, whose eyes were often upon her, was quick to note. "Thou still believest this churl to be a knight, Princess Guinalda?" he demanded. "Have I said aught?" she asked. "Thou didst not laugh," he reminded her. "He is a stranger knight, far from his own country, and it seemeth not a knightly nor a gentle thing to ridicule him," she replied. "Therefore I did not laugh, for I was not amused." Later that day, as Blake joined the others in the great court, he ran directly into Malud's party, nor was it at all an accident, as he never made any effort to avoid Malud or his friends, and was seemingly oblivious to their thinly veiled taunts and insinuations. Malud himself attributed this to the density and ignorance of a yokel, which he insisted Blake to be, but there were others who rather admired Blake for his attitude, seeing in it a studied affront that Malud was too dense to perceive. Most of the inmates of the grim castle of Nimar were inclined pleasantly toward the newcomer. He had brought with him an air of freshness and newness that was rather a relief from the hoary atmosphere that had surrounded Nimar for nearly 7.5 centuries. He had brought them new words and new expressions and new views, which many of them were joyously adopting, and had it not been for the unreasoning antagonism of the influential Sir Mallard, Blake had been accepted with open arms. Sir Richard was far more popular than Mallard, but lacked the latter's wealth in horses, arms, and retainers, and consequently had less influence with Prince Gobred. However, there were many independent souls who either followed Sir Richard because they were fond of him, or arrived at their own decisions without reference to the dictates of policy, and many of these were staunch friends to Blake. Not all of those who surrounded Malud this afternoon were antagonistic to the American, but the majority of them laughed when Malud laughed, and frowned when he frowned. For in the courts of kings and princes flourished the first order of yes-men. Blake was greeted by many a smile and nod as he advanced and bowed low before the Princess Guinalda, who was one of the company, and, being of princely blood, entitled to his first devoirs. "Thou didst well this morning, Sir James," said the princess kindly. "It pleases me greatly to see thee ride. Methinketh 'twould be a rare treat to see him serve a side of venison," sneered Malud. This provoked so much laughter that Malud was encouraged to seek further applause. "Odzooks," he cried, "arm him with a trencher and carving knife, and he would be at home." "Speaking of serving," said Blake, "and Sir Malud's mind seems to be more occupied with that than with more knightly things. Does any of you know what is necessary quickly to serve fresh pig?" "Nay, fair Sir Knight," said Guinalda, "we know not. Prithee tell us." "Yes, tell us," roared Malud. "Thou indeed shouldst know. You said a mouthful, old scout, I do know. "And what be necessary that you may quickly serve fresh pig?" demanded Malud, looking about him and winking. "A trencher, a carving knife, and you, Sir Malud," replied Blake. It was several seconds before the thrust penetrated their simple minds, and it was the Princess Guinalda who first broke into merry laughter, and soon all were roaring, while some explained the quip to others. No, not all were laughing. Not Sir Malud. When he grasped the significance of Blake's witticism, he first turned very red and then went white, for the great Sir Malud liked not to be the butt of ridicule, which is ever the way of those most prone to turn ridicule upon others. "Sirrah," he cried, "darest thou affront Malud? Odds blood, fellow, low-born varlet, only thy blood canst atone this affront." "Hop to it, old thing," replied Blake. "Name your poison." "I knowest not the meaning of thy silly words," cried Malud, "but I know that an thou doest not meet me in fair tilt, upon the morrow I shall whip thee across the valley of the Holy Sepulchre with a barrel stave." "You're on," snapped back Blake. "Tomorrow morning in the South Ballium, with—" "Thou mayest choose the weapons, sirrah," said Malud. "Don't call me sirrah, I don't like it," said Blake very quietly, and now he was not smiling. "I want to tell you something, Malud, that may be good for your soul. You are really the only man in Nimmer who didn't want to treat me well and give me a chance, a fair chance, to prove that I am all right. You think you are a great knight, but you are not. You have no intelligence, no heart, no chivalry. You are not what we would call in my country a good sport. You have a few horses and a few men-at-arms. That is all you have, for without them you would not have the favor of the prince, and without his favor you would have no friends. You are not so good or great a man in any way as is Sir Richard, who combines all the qualities of chivalry that for centuries have glorified the order of knighthood. Nor are you so good a man as I, who, with your own weapons, will best you on the morrow, when, in the North Ballium, I meet you on horseback with sword and buckler." The members of the party, upon seeing Malud's wrath, had gradually fallen away from Blake until, as he concluded his speech, he stood alone a few paces apart from Malud and those who surrounded him. Then it was that one stepped from among those at Malud's side and walked to Blake. It was Guinalda. "Sir James," she said with a sweet smile, "thou spokest with thy mouth full." She broke into a merry laugh. "Walk with me in the garden, Sir Knight," and taking his arm she guided him toward the south end of the eastern court. "You're wonderful," was all that Blake could find to say. "Dost really think I be wonderful?" she demanded. "'Tis hard to know if men speak the truth to such as I. The truth, as people see it, is spoke more oft to slaves than princes." I hope to prove it by my conduct, he said. They had drawn a short distance away from the others now, and the girl suddenly laid her hand impulsively upon his. I brought thee away, Sir James, that I might speak with thee alone, she said. I do not care what the reason was, so long as you did it, he replied, smiling. Thou art a stranger among us, unaccustomed to our ways, unversed in knightly practice, so much so that there are many who doubt thy claims to knighthood. Yet thou art a brave man, or else a very simple one, or thou wouldst never have chosen to meet Sir Malud with sword and buckler, for he be skilled with these while thou art clumsy with them. Because I thinkest that thou goest to thy death tomorrow, I have brought thee aside to speak with thee. What can be done about it now? Asked Blake. Thou art passing fair with thy lance, she said, and it is still not too late to change thy selection of weapons. I beg thee to do so. You care? He asked. There can be a world of meaning in 2 words. The girl's eyes dropped for an instant and then flashed up to his, and there was a touch of hauteur in them. I am the daughter of the Prince of Nimmer, she said. I care for the humblest of my father's subjects. I guess that will hold you for a while, Sir James, thought Blake. But to the girl he said nothing, only smiled. Presently she stamped her foot. Thou hast an impudent smile, sirrah, she exclaimed angrily. Meliketh it not. Then thou art too forward with the daughter of a prince. I merely asked you if you cared whether I was killed. Even a cat could ask that. And I replied, why then, didst thou smile? Because your eyes had answered me before your lips had spoken, and I knew that your eyes had told the truth. Again she stamped her foot angrily. Thou art indeed a forward boor, she exclaimed. I shall not remain to be insulted further. Her head held high, she turned and walked haughtily away to rejoin the other party. Blake stepped quickly after her. Tomorrow, he whispered, I meet Sir Malud with sword and buckler. With your favor upon my helm, I could overthrow the best sword in Nimar. The Princess Guinalda did not deign to acknowledge that she had heard his words as she walked on to join the others clustered about Sir Malud. Chapter 12. Tomorrow thou diest. There was a great celebration in the village of Batando the chief the night that Ulala returned. A goat was killed and many chickens, and there were fruit and cassava bread and native beer in plenty for all. There was music too and dancing, with all of which it was morning before they sought their sleeping mats, with the result that it was afternoon the following day, before Feijuan had an opportunity to speak of serious matters with Batando. When finally he sought him out, he found the old chief squatting in the shade before his hut, slightly the worse for the orgy of the preceding night. I have come to talk with you, Batando, he said, of the desert people. Batando grunted. His head ached. Yesterday you said that you would lead them to the entrance to the Forbidden Valley, said Feijuan. You mean, then, that you will not fight them? We shall not have to fight them if we lead them to the entrance to the Forbidden Valley, replied Batando. You speak in riddles, said Feijuan. Listen, Ulala, replied the old chief. In childhood you were stolen from your people and taken from your country. Being young, there were many things you did not know, and there are others that you have forgotten. It is not difficult to enter the Forbidden Valley, especially from the north. Every Gala knows how to find the northern pass through the mountains or the tunnel beyond the Great Cross that marks the southern entrance. There are only these 2 ways in. Every Gala knows them, but every Gala also knows that there is no way out of the Forbidden Valley. What do you mean, Batando? Demanded Feijuan. If there are 2 ways in, there must be 2 ways out. No, there is no way out, insisted the chief. As far back as goes the memory of man or the tales of our fathers and our fathers' fathers, It is known that many men have entered the Forbidden Valley, and it is also known that no man has ever come out of it. And why have they not come out? Batondo shook his head. Who knows? He asked. We cannot even guess their fate. What sort of people inhabit the valley? Asked Fejuan. Not even that is known. No man has seen them and returned to tell. Some say they are the spirits of the dead, others that the valley is peopled by leopards. But no one knows. Go therefore, Ulala, and tell the chief of the desert people that we will lead him to the entrance to the valley. If we do this, we shall not have to fight him and his people, nor shall we ever again be bothered by them. And Batondo laughed at his little joke. Will you send guides back with me to lead the Bedawi to the valley? Asked Fejuan. No, replied the chief. Tell them we shall come in 3 days. In the meantime, I shall gather together many warriors from other villages, for I do not trust the desert people. Thus we shall conduct them through our country. Explain this to their chief, and also that in payment he must release to us all the gala slaves he has with him before he enters the valley. That Ibn Jad will not do, said Fejuan. Perhaps when he sees himself surrounded by gala warriors, he will be glad to do even more, replied Batondo. And so Fejuan, the gala slave, returned to his masters and reported all that Batondo had told him to report. Ibn Jad at first refused to give up his slaves, but when Fejuan had convinced him that under no other terms would Batondo lead him to the entrance to the valley, and that his refusal to liberate the slaves would invite the hostile attentions of the Gallas, he finally consented. But in the back of his mind was the thought that before his promise was consummated, he might find an opportunity to evade it. Only one regret had Fejuan in betraying the Bedouins, and that was caused by his liking for Ataya. But being a fatalist, he was consoled by the conviction that whatever was to be would be, regardless of what he might do. And as Ibn Jad waited and Batondo gathered his black warriors from far and near, Tarzan of the Apes came to the waterhole of the smooth, round rocks and took up the trail of the Bedouins. Since he had learned from Blake's blacks that the young American was missing, and also that they had seen nothing of Stimbul since the latter had separated from Blake and started for the coast, the ape-man was more convinced than ever that the white prisoner among the Arabs was Blake. Still, he felt no great concern for the man's safety, for if the Bedouins had sufficient hopes of reward to spare his life at all, he was in no great danger from them. Reasoning thus, Tarzan made no pretense of speed as he followed the spoor of Ibn Jad and his people. 2 men sat upon rough benches at opposite sides of a rude table. Between them a cresset of oil with a cotton wick laying in it burned feebly, slightly illuminating the stone flagging of the floor and casting weird shadows of themselves upon the rough stone walls. Through a narrow window, innocent of glass, the night air blew, driving the flame of the cresset now this way, now that. Upon the table between the men lay a square board blocked off into squares, and within some of these were several wooden pieces. "It is your move, Richard," said one of the men. "You don't appear to be very keen about the game tonight. What's the matter?" "I be thinking of the morrow, James, and my heart be heavy within me," replied the other. "And why?" demanded Blake. "Malud is not the best swordsman in Nimmer," replied Sir Richard, "but—" He hesitated. "I am the worst," Blake finished the sentence for him, laughingly. Sir Richard looked up and smiled. "Thou wilt always joke, even in the face of death," he said. "Art all the men of this strange country thou tell'st of alike?" "It is your move, Richard," said Blake. "Hide not his sword from thine eyes with thy buckler, James," cautioned Richard. "Ever keep thine eyes upon his eyes until thou knowest whereat he striketh. Then, with thy buckler ready, thou mayest intercept the blow, for he be over slow, and always his eyes proclaim where his blade will fall. Full well I knoweth that for often have I exercised against him. And he hasn't killed you, Blake reminded him. Ah, we did but practice, but on the morrow it will be different, for Malud engages thee to the death, in mortal combat, my friend, to wash away in blood the affront thou didst put upon him. He wants to kill me just for that, asked Blake. I'll tell the world he's a touchy little rascal. Were it only that, he might be satisfied merely to draw blood, but there is more that he hath against thee. More? What? I've scarcely spoken to him a dozen times, said Blake. He be jealous. Jealous? Of whom? He would wed the princess, and he hath seen in what manner thou lookest at her, explained Richard. Poppycock, cried Blake, but he flushed. Nay, he be not the only one who hath marked it, insisted Richard. You're crazy, snapped Blake. Often men look thus at the princess, for she be beautiful beyond compare, but— Has he killed them all? Demanded the American. No, for the princess didst not look back at them in the same manner. Blake leaned back upon his bench and laughed. Now I know you're crazy, he cried, all of you. I'll admit that I think the princess is a mighty sweet kid, but say, young fellow, she can't see me a little bit. Enough of thy outlandish speech, I grasp to gather thy meaning, James, but thou canst not confuse me upon the one subject, nor deceive me upon the other. The eyes of the princess seldom leave thee whilst thou art at practice upon the lists, and the look in thine, when they rest upon her. Hast ever seen a hound adoring his master? Run along and sell your papers, admonished Blake. For this, Malud, wouldst put thee out of the way, and it is because I know this that I grieve, for I have learned to like thee over well, my friend. Blake arose and came around the end of the table. You're a good old scout, Richard, he said, placing a hand affectionately upon the other's shoulder. But do not worry, I am not dead yet. I know I seem awkward with the sword, but I have learned much about its possibilities within the past few days, and I think that Sir Malud has a surprise awaiting him. Thy courage and thy vast assurance should carry thee far, James, but they may not overcome a lifetime of practice with the sword, and that is the advantage Malud hath over thee. Does Prince Gobred favor Malud's suit? Demanded Blake. Why not? Malud is a powerful knight with a great castle of his own and many horses and retainers. Besides a dozen knights, he hath fully 100 men-at-arms. There are several knights who have their own castles and following, are there not? Asked Blake. 20, perchance, replied Richard. And they live close to Gobred's castle, at the edge of the hills, within 3 leagues upon either hand of Gobred's castle, explained Richard. And no others live in all this great valley? Demanded Blake. You have heard mention made of Bohun? Asked Richard. Yes, often. Why? He calls himself king, but never will we refer to him as king. He and his followers dwell upon the opposite side of the valley. They number, perchance, as many as we, and we be always at war against them. But I've been hearing quite a bit about a great tournament for which the knights are practicing now. I thought that Bohun and his knights were to take part in it. They be. Once each year, commencing upon the first Sunday of Lent, and extending over a period of 3 days, there hath been from time immemorial a truce declared between the fronters and the backers, during which is held the great tourney, 1 year in the plain before the city of Nimmer, and the next year in the plain before the city of the Sepulchre, as they call it. Fronters and backers, what in heck do those mean? Demanded Blake. Thou art a knight of Nimir, and know not that, exclaimed Richard. What I know about knighting would rattle around in a peanut shell, admitted Blake. Thou shouldst know, and I shall tell thee. Hark thee well, then, said Richard, For I must need go back to the very beginning. He poured 2 goblets of wine from a flagon standing on the floor beside him, took a long drink, and proceeded with his tale. Richard I sailed from Sicily in the spring of 1191 with all his great following bound for Acre, where he was to meet the French king, Philip Augustus, and wrest the Holy Land from the power of the Saracen. But Richard tarried upon the way to conquer Cyprus and punish the vile despot who had placed an insult upon Berengaria, whom Richard was to wed. When the great company again set their sails for Acre, there were many Cyprian maidens hidden away upon the ships by knights who had taken a fancy to their lovely faces, and it so befell that 2 of these ships, encountering a storm, were blown from their course and wrecked upon the Afric shore. One of these companies was commanded by a knight yclept Bohun, and the other by one Gobred, and though they marched together, they kept separate, other than when attacked. Thus, searching for Jerusalem, they came upon this valley which the followers of Bohun declared was the Valley of the Holy Sepulchre, and that the crusade was over. Their crosses that they had worn upon their breasts, as do all crusaders who have not reached their goal, they removed and placed upon their backs to signify that the crusade was over and that they were returning home. Gobred insisted that this was not the Valley of the Holy Sepulchre, and that the crusade was not accomplished. He, therefore, and all his followers, retained their crosses upon their breasts, and built a city and a strong castle to defend the entrance to the valley, that Bohun and his followers might be prevented from returning to England until they had accomplished their mission. Bohun crossed the valley and built a city and a castle to prevent Gobred from pushing on in the direction in which the latter knew that the true sepulchre lay. And for nearly 7.5 centuries, the descendants of Bohun have prevented the descendants of Gobred from pushing on and rescuing the Holy Land from the Saracen, while the descendants of Gobred have prevented the descendants of Bohun from returning to England, to the dishonor of knighthood. Gobred took the title of Prince and Bohun that of King, and these titles have been handed down from father to son during the centuries, while the followers of Gobred still wear the cross upon their breasts, and are called therefrom the Fronters, and the followers of Bohun wear theirs upon their backs, and are called Backers. "And you would still push on and liberate the Holy Land?" asked Blake. "Yes," replied Richard, "and the Backers would return to England. But long since have we realized the futility of either hope, since we be surrounded by a vast army of Saracens, and our numbers be too few to pit against them. Thinkest thou not that we are wise to remain here under such stress?" he demanded. "Well, you'd certainly surprise him if you rode into Jerusalem or London, either," admitted Blake. "On the whole, Richard, I'd remain right here, if I were you. You see, after 735 years, most of the home folks may have forgotten you, and even the Saracens might not know what it was all about if you came charging into Jerusalem." "Mayhap you speak wisely, James," said Richard, "and then, too, we be content here, knowing no other country." For a while, both men were silent in thought. Blake was the first to speak. "This big tourney interests me," he said. "You say it starts the first Sunday in Lent. That's not far away." "No, not far. Why?" "I was wondering if you thought I'd be in shape to have a part in it. I'm getting better and better with the lance every day." Sir Richard looked sadly at him and shook his head. "Tomorrow thou wilt be dead," he said. "Say, you're a cheerful party," exclaimed Blake. "I am only truthful, good friend," replied Richard. "It grieveth my heart sorely that it should be true, but true it be thou canst not prevail over Sir Malud on the morrow. Wouldst that I might take thy place in the lists against him, but that may not be. But I console myself with the thought that thou wilt comport thyself courageously and die as a good Sir Knight should, with no stain upon thy escutcheon. Greatly will it solace the Princess Guinalda to know that thou didst die thus. You think so? Ventured Blake. Verily. And if I don't die, will she be put out? Put out? Put out of what? Demanded Richard. Will she be sore vexed then? Corrected Blake. I should not go so far as to say that, admitted Richard. But natheless it appears certain that no lady would rejoice to see her promised husband overthrown and killed. And if thou art not slain, it may only be because thou hast slain Malud. She is his affianced wife, demanded Blake. 'Tis understood, that be all. As yet no formal marriage banns have been proclaimed. I'm going to turn in, snapped Blake. If I've got to be killed tomorrow, I ought to get a little sleep tonight. As he stretched himself upon a rough wool blanket that was spread over a bed of rushes upon the stone floor in one corner of the room, and drew another similar blanket over him, he felt less like sleep than he had ever felt before. The knowledge that on the morrow he was to meet a medieval knight in mortal combat naturally gave him considerable concern. But Blake was too self-reliant and too young to seriously harbor the belief that he would be the one to be killed. He knew it was possible, but he did not intend to permit the thought to upset him. There was, however, another that did. It upset him very much, and too it made him angry when he realized that he was concerned about it, about the proposed marriage of Sir Malud of West Castle and Guinalda, Princess of Nimr. Could it be that he had been ass enough, he soliloquized, to have fallen in love with this little medieval princess, who probably looked upon him as dirt beneath her feet? And what was he going to do about Malud? Suppose he should get the better of the fellow on the morrow? Well, what about it? If he killed him, that would make Guinalda unhappy. If he didn't kill him, what? Sir James did not know.